Hello and welcome to this special edition here of my videos. We're going to be covering Chapter 17, Government and Politics. Little apology for the washed out sense of my slides here. I can't seem to adjust my video feed here, but we're going to be talking about Chapter 17 here. I was out because I was sick. Let's see if we can get through some of this. I want to start off with a little cartoon that brings to mind the fact that Dr. Seuss was not only famous for his cartoons for children and his books and Cat in the Hat and Green Eggs and Ham and all that, but he was also a very prolific political cartoonist. And if you ever visit his museum in Massachusetts, you can see a large collection of his political cartoons like here. So, moving on into this chapter, we want to start off by talking about the concept of decision making. And that's where we're going to go in terms of where does politics manifest in all groups. We think of politics, oftentimes we're thinking about government. Politics is the process by which we manage resources and make decisions. Now, when we get into politics, we start talking about political power. Then that power is the ability to manage resources and make decisions. So first, let's look at the way in general that we as human beings make decisions. So first and foremost, we use prior experience. I've been there, done that. This is what I did the last time. This is what I'm going to do this next time. And we may evaluate a person's ability, their power in terms of decision making by the fact that they're the most experienced individual. We do have cognitive bias. Now, we have patterns of thought, patterns of decision making that we get into because of prior experience. So these are sort of contrary to each other. We might have prior experience, but that may be advantageous or disadvantageous depending on the context of the decision that you're trying to make. The amount of time we have invested into a particular situation influences and is part of our decision making. It's difficult for us to make a decision to drop something once we've invested a whole bunch of time or effort into it. We see this both in terms of the effortful things that we do for goal attainment, and once we put a whole lot into it, it's really hard to stop, and you feel like you have lost a lot more than just not attaining that goal. But we also see the decision making to remain in a cognitive bias. Now, these are intertwining here. So if we have a cognitive bias based on prior experience, the other factor that keeps us from giving up that bias is the time we have invested in building it. So if I've been a Democrat my whole life and I have a lot of investment into that philosophy, even if something comes along that sort of counters that, it's going to be difficult for me to move away from that particular point of view. Now, I'm not saying that applies necessarily to me or to you, but that is a factor that comes in to our decision making. Individual differences that people might have reflect decision making. Some people may have personality skills and traits that lead them to be leaders and decision makers. Individuals could have a job title that gives them the decision making and or expertise. Both of those factors would give that individual authority. And we're also going to talk about authority in terms of political structures here. So authority in that regard, we would have an individual who's expert, an individual has that job title, and then there's the social contract. When we start going into the sociology of politics, let's say government, the individuals that are making decisions are individuals in a democracy that have been elected and placed into those decision-making places. Now, not all aspects of the government work that way. There's appointing, just like we saw very recently, the appointment of a brand new Supreme Court Justice. Sorry about that. A historical one. And that individual is being placed in a decision-making capacity, certainly. And we saw the process, as ugly as it got, we saw that process of elected individuals first nominating and then vetting and then finally interviewing and ratifying and placing that person into that position. So sometimes that democratic process comes along the way when we are identifying job titles as individuals or people to fill job titles where they have authority. And finally, we can make decisions, based on data. Now, data can play into all of these, obviously. But science itself, one of the gifts of science is to remove some of that prior experience bias, remove some of that individual personality, it removes some of that time invested bias that we have, remove even authority and say, let's let the numbers, let's let the facts speak to this decision making. Now, all of these processes are going on within every single political instance, whether it's in a family deciding what they're going to have for dinner, or whether it's making the electing and putting into place, they're not electing, but putting into place a new Supreme Court justice. All of these things were brought to bear in those decision-making processes. So, in sociology, we study groups and cultures. Groups all have a culture. So every single group, remember when we define groups, we are looking at individuals that have a shared identity, interact frequently, often have shared goals, shared values, norms, expectations. We'll see that just in a little bit. Those kinds of things. Each one of those groups has a culture made up of norms, values, and expectations. There is a process of social control. We've already seen that. Part of that social control are the mechanisms for managing power and authority, and this is where politics comes in. Oftentimes, the people or structures, individuals or other groups or subgroups or whatever that are designated with the actions related to social control are managing power, and they have authority to do so. This is where we see politics. In general society, we see that just think of speeding tickets. We see the legislature, which has been elected and therefore given the authority to create law. They create a law that puts a speed limit on the highway. That's communicated to the public through the signs, maybe even through advertisements if it changed, like when we went from 55. None of you remember that. It used to be 55. That's why Sammy Hagar could never drive 55. Then there was 65, and up on the highway now it's 70, sometimes 75. Those changes are all prescripted by law through the decision-making process there. And then there's the enforcement process, the enforcement that's part of social control. So we're driving along, and we signed off on our license, and part of that is pretty much admitting that we're going to pay attention to signs. So we're saying, I'm going to pay attention to signs, and so I'm going along, and that's why the excuse, I didn't see the sign, doesn't really fly often. But we're going along, and we're exceeding the accepted standard of speed. Then authority figures, individuals granted authority, can pull me over. These are our police, our state police, sheriff, local police, can pull me over for speeding. Now, my neighbor is not a police officer, and they can see me speeding, and they can take a picture of me and they can yell at me and they can do all kinds of things, but they can't pull me over and give me a ticket. That authority to pull me over, stop me, basically arrest, to stop my car, arrest me. It's not a full arrest, but an arrest me by stopping me, providing me with a ticket that is accusing me of speeding. That authority rests within that individual who has the job title as police officer. Not anybody can do that. So within this, with that example, within this, we see that all groups have politics. They all have a culture, social control, something's managing power and authority and decision making. That's where politics are, that little everywhere. And then all groups have politics. The management of power and authority rests within the group. The group has resources. Power is the ability to move those resources, to activate those resources. Power leads to, can be found, in an individual or a group of people. So, let's see. In my family, there's 2 of us, and managing our household, my wife and I, and we have resources, money, objects, stuff, those kind of things, and we talk about managing those things. Now, little information, we also give, we both work and we get paid, and we give ourselves an allowance. So we have 3 separate checking accounts. She has a checking account for her, I have a checking account for me, and we have a checking account that we refer to as the bill account. I am totally in charge of my own account. Whatever goes in there, I can do whatever I want with it. I can waste it, I can save it, I can buy a new guitar, which, as far as my wife is concerned, is both a waste and... Anyway, she can do whatever she wants. So she has power and authority over that. The fund in the middle, the bill account, which we both have clear access to, is agreed upon, but that we will decide what happens with that money as a pair, as a group, a small group of 2 people. And so once a month we get together, we lay out all the bills, we do all the transfers and stuff like that, and we decide where money's going to go and how much in savings, how much goes here. And sometimes if we have a little extra, we give ourselves a little bonus. Good job. Sometimes we're a little short. We have to go into savings, put that in there. All that kind of management, we decide to do that as a pair. When one or both of us has been absent, let's say I'm on a gig trip, or there's that happens, or when Katie was in the hospital and it came to that time, it was very disruptive to move from, this used to be us talking about this, which we got a lot of satisfaction out of, to just one person taking on that particular decision making was disruptive. And so that's how it could happen in a family, and certainly we can see the management of resources and whatnot. We're seeing it go on in Eastern Europe right now, with individual countries deciding to manage their resources and send them over to assist the people in Ukraine. The resources that are managed within the Soviet Union, with Russia, mobilizing those resources, decision-making there, all kinds of news items about who's talking to who and who's authorized to do what and where's NATO and all this thing. Lots of decision-makers trying to make the best of a very bad situation. And we see that politics playing out in this particular scenario pretty dramatically. So this individual or group of individuals within a group, sometimes the processes of managing resources are immortalized in a document, such as the law or the policy manual or marriage contracts or whatever. And that often dictates a decision-making hierarchy. Now, in relatively large organizations like KVCC, for example, decision-making is sometimes multi-level. So right down to, as a chair, I decide, for the most part, when and where a class is going to be offered. So we offer a certain amount of sociology classes every semester, online, face-to-face, 2 campuses, at high schools. It's all over the place. And I set that schedule. Now, I've been doing pretty much the same schedule for quite some time, and that is my responsibility. But then there's other levels of decision making. If something came along and the administration for KVCC felt that there needed to be, let's say there's a new program that's coming in, and they absolutely need to have a Friday afternoon section where we're putting the general eds in, and sociology is one of those, I may have to add that to my schedule, find an individual to teach that. And that decision came from, well, it was decided, with the program, so when they're going to have that opening for the sociology class, and then that goes up to the academic dean, and then the academic dean contacts me and says, we're going to need a sociology class on Fridays. There we go. And it could go even higher, up to not only the deans, so there's an academic dean, a dean of finance, a dean of technology. We go above that all the way to the president, and then above the president is the president of the community college system. Now, one example too of decision making that's going on is we're in the process right now of waiting to find out who our next president is going to be. So there was a committee that was put together, and that committee vetted all the applicants, and they put forward 2 names in priority. So who's our number 1? Who's our number 2? That was their task. So there was a decision-making process going on there. That went to the president of the entire community college system, David Dagler. He has met with that committee, got their feedback. He's meeting with each individual, but the decision is his and his alone. Even if he could even hire someone else outside of those 2 recommendations. It's his power. That's ultimately where the buck stops, like they say. That's an old saying. Where the buck stops, that's where the ultimate decision and responsibility falls in. So we see within the policy documents of KVCC, we see the delineations of decision making and people and certain amounts of power, and there's often a process of negotiating that. How much power do we keep down low and really give people control over their jobs and their lives is a very important part of having creative, vital employees in a business. The ownership into what they're doing. When everything's top down, things are, I'm just a cog in the wheel of the machinery. That's not a very satisfying place to be. So we, as an organization, adjust policy through negotiations to delineate certain pockets of power and control over day-to-day operations. But ultimately, we have our president and we have the president of the community college system. So these are complex. These are complex relationships when it comes to decision making within an organization, and they're highly political as well because the management of power and authority is political. So that power goes back to the group. We have this hierarchy. We have this document. When something is documented and it delineates individual responsibility in decision making, we consider that to be the authority. Now, let's get big on this one. Let's look at the Constitution of the United States. One of the things about the experiment of the United States was they wanted to build a nation that was not built on a lineage of kings, and they wanted to move into this way of decision making where the law of the land wasn't the words of an individual, it wasn't the words of a sacred text, it was a document that had been created and agreed upon by the people who were going to be governed by that document. Pretty amazing thing that really had not been going on anywhere up until that time, at least not on a large scale. And our country to this day is still a country of the Constitution. The people that are in power are there temporarily. Ultimately, the document is what is important, and therefore that is why the Chief Justices of the Supreme Court are so vital. Their job is to interpret the Constitution. And the relative balance that we hear of, conservative versus liberal, is really not a matter of conservative viewpoints and liberal viewpoints as much as it is individuals who like to look at the Constitution as it was meant to be when it was created, trying to get into the mindset of what those individuals were trying to do. There's more traditionalists, and then there are modernists that say, well, that's fine and dandy, but they weren't dealing with the issues that we have now. What do we think they would have meant by this if they knew our current circumstances? Those are the more progressive type decisions and interpretations of the Constitution that we see. And it's the relative balance within the Supreme Court of traditionalists versus modernists is sort of like what politicians are negotiating with, scared of, those kinds of things. Certainly one of the big issues that's coming up, in terms of gender identity, in terms of women's reproductive rights, those things are issues that were not present. At least they weren't on the minds of the founding fathers of the country. So the relatively conservative viewpoints of that age would have a negative impact, if applied today, would have a negative impact on the laws protecting the rights of individuals with different genders and women's reproductive rights. So that's one of those things that people are kind of looking at and waiting to see what's going to happen with this this Constitution of our Supreme Court. Now, we spent some time talking about religion, and so just harking back to there, and I mentioned the church that I go to, and we asked, well, who's the authority here? And we spent a little bit of time looking at the document that was published, and I put a copy of it in the course book, that delineated secular and sacred authority. And what I think was really magical about that particular document was that it drew a line as to authority in terms of power and control over resources and what you do. It said, this is of the world, this is of God, and they may be contrary to each other, but they can live together. And that document attempted to clarify that, the church does respond as a church, as many organizations of faith do. They respond to what they consider to be a higher authority than any constitution. But yet, those institutions are embedded within societies that have their own structures. And the document that was published by the leadership at the church that I go to did a really great job with delineating that and actually showing within the sacred text where individuals were told to obey the authorities of the land as well as authority of God. So just another way to kind of look at authority, power, control, politics, all of these things as they play out in the family, in any group that you belong to. They play out in our classroom, they play out at our churches and synagogues and other places of worship, they play out in our workplace, in our government, both local, in our town, in our state, and all the way up to the federal, and even international, as we're getting a glimpse into these complex movements and whatnot, trying to resolve the issue in Ukraine. So that was my talk for this particular chapter. There's no assignment. There's a discussion where I have individuals look at that document about leadership and authority at Faith Church. But that's not something you need to do. So that was the chapter. That's my lecture on politics. So we'll end right here, and I'm going to go over and I'm going to do chapter 18 for you. So I hope you enjoyed this little lesson here. I'm trying to go really fast so it doesn't take up too much of your time, because you can always rewind it and watch it again and again and again. If you have trouble sleeping, you can watch it over and over. So I'll see you in class.